Hey everybody, welcome to Building Jam episode 6. We have a special guest today, Chris, who's our designer. In this episode, we're going to talk about how we're working on designing new features and how we're thinking about onboarding for a new product. And like always, we're going to talk about our weekly challenges. So let's get right into it.
There are all these big projects in a company, and then there are all these little details that bother you and some users for months and months and months, and finally you fix them. And Chris just fixed one of them. Maybe we start with that one, which is the when you share a jam over Slack, just how it appears in Slack, cleaning it up and making it just nicer.
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, let's see. Yeah, as Danny mentioned, it's a small update, but a meaningful one, just because of how much people use the Slack integration. And we were experiencing this ourselves, pasting lots of jams into our Slack and just having them take up so much vertical space. So we took a look at that and really tried to essentialize the information down and compact the vertical scale and again keep what we need in the context of Slack. So one kind of cool thing that we did, instead of doing going into Figma and trying to lay this out, Slack has this cool block kit builder, and it lets you actually compose and preview what the message is going to look like. And it has this markdown language. So this is cool, working in the medium of the tools that you're building for. And so this was I guess just to describe what it was before, because I don't have that one handy, but the image used to be full width, which means also variable height. And so you can imagine this was on top and just taking up so much space. We have all this metadata too, as well as the description. So we were first okay, what if actually the description is the most important thing in this context, and the visual, maybe that's not as important. Maybe people can't really parse the details in a preview context anyway and are clicking the link. So maybe we minimize that and we go for this 2-column thing. And what if the metadata is below? So that was iteration number 1. And the cool thing about this tool is you can send it to Slack to actually see what it feels like. So this was kind of the design and iteration process for this is look at all the templates they have. And just to give you a sense of
wow,
there are restrictions, but there are some things that you can stack together like Lego blocks to compose what this looks like. So kind of started from a template and then started to massage some of the content and the markdown. So this is the first one that we tried. And it just felt I don't know, especially on mobile, this image preview was even smaller. And it's okay, maybe the visual isn't the most important thing, but we know it needs to be bigger than that. And so just in a new tab, I have what we did next, which is just, what if we go back to the full-size image as we had before, but maybe it's the metadata isn't so instructive here. And so maybe we can just hide that in the Slack preview. And then Danny and I were chatting, and this kind of side issue came up, which is right now in a jam. So in addition to capturing your screen, you can also include attachments. And right now, if you have attachments, the way that shows up in the Slack message is in the reply, we add the images to the reply of the message you see. We're what if we just have a little thumbnail down here and say 1 attachments or 2 attachments. We were just had the hunch that it wasn't super intuitive or expected that you would have full replies in Slack.
Chris, when you were going through this, by the way, I don't know if you have ever built a a Slack integration like before. I wish I
No.
had a block kit builder when I first built integration with Slack. This is super cool. As you're going through these like different iterations, like you're walking us through like why and the how behind it, but other than of course the feel of it, like are you going through like a checklist? Like why are these the things that you're looking into? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like it's trying to make the experience of getting a gem and sharing that in the context of Slack, a lot of that is just because we send so many to ourselves. We are the users in this case, and like our pain points are kind of intuitively feel what they are and get, I think we've had that feedback too from our actual customers, but this is like feedback that we all have shared with one another in the past. And so like the overall kind of challenge was framed up that way. It's like, we know we want to make these more usable and take up less space when we're sharing them, because it's like, it gets you lost in the thread.
So it's a lot like, we put out this thing and, like we've been hearing feedback, like I'm sure complaining in Slack about it.
Yeah.
And you're like absorbing these things. And as you're iterating on the next version, you're going through that mental checklist. Okay, like are all of those things addressed? Like if it makes sense to you as a designer.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, and the experience of getting them myself, right? So it's like often with design, you're like putting yourself in your user's shoes. In this case, it was more straightforward because I experienced these pain points myself. But there are like legit questions here, like, before we were exposing the metadata, and now the hunch is, well, maybe that's less important in this context. So I think there are things that we want to iterate on and we will continue to get feedback on. But yeah, it's kind of placing some stakes in the ground and making bets about what is going to be a net better experience, and just trying to prioritize the information too. And the next like iteration, this is like Danny and I chatting, and this actually was sparked from the idea about attachments. There's this block that Slack has here where it can either just be like a line of text or a thumbnail image and text. And before we were like, how do we solve the attachments thing? Where the hunch was people aren't actually seeing those in the Slack reply because it's kind of an unexpected thing. So instead, like, what if we just signal how many attachments there were? And I shared that with Danny, like we were going through, how does this feel? How does that feel? Kind of collaboration on this. And the idea was sparked about, well, we're hiding now like some of the metadata. How do we like summarize what's going on here for somebody? Like, yes, we have the visual. Yes, we have the description. But this felt like a cool unlock in the process where like in one very minimal space efficient move, we've communicated so much about what this is all about. And the minute we like prototyped this and put in the emojis, it felt kind of like iconic and, oh, this is a jam. Like I just got a jam in Slack. Versus before, it felt like maybe we stripped out too much. Maybe it's not as useful without that context.
I can totally see, like, first of all, I haven't seen this before. This is cool. I can totally see very niche t-shirt designs where it's only one network error or three.
That's good.
I thought it looked better too, but I also didn't want to say like, oh yeah, like we went with it, right? And then have it not be the one. So I feel like you implied that's the one.
what's cool, so Chris, by the way, is giving me like way too much credit. He's like, oh, it's a collaboration back and forth. It's not a collaboration.
Totally was.
Doing all the work, and then like slacks me and goes, here's what I'm thinking, and I'm like, oh, cool, like not but one thing that's cool is so then Chris asked the engineers, like, can we do this? And they're like, oh, we need to do like some rewiring to be able to extract that information, to have that available, to display it. But then once we do that, well, then that information suddenly is available. And so then Maya and I are chatting, and we're like, where else should this go in the product? And it's like every email notification, like, what is a jam? It's not just the visual of like what was captured on the screen, but the fact that there are developer logs behind it. And we don't say just like, now it's like open to see dev logs, but in the email, when a jam is shared with you, it should say exactly this line, like what's in it. And in the URL preview, like if you just paste a jam into WhatsApp and like there's like the URL preview, that should be in there too. And so I think Chris is right. I think it feels iconic and that it tells you what jam is. It's like so clear just from the packaging what the product does. And I think it will change jam across a lot more surface areas than just a Slack unfurl. Like I think it's actually a really cool detail.
Yeah. And I mean, it is a good example of like, there is some serendipity in the design process. And I use design like very broadly here. The design tool in this case was like this builder kit using Markdown. And I was refreshing myself on Markdown syntax, like trying to piece it together. But yeah, it's like this idea actually sprang from us seeing and reacting to this piece of information, but about attachments, and like seeing that sparked an idea. So there's often that like serendipity of discovery where like, I'm not sure I or we would have gotten here before if we didn't go through that process.
And doesn't it seem so obvious in hindsight now?
Totally.
One thing Chris said that I think is really important is, as Chris was talking about like how did we get here, he was talking about like it was our own experience using the product. And I think that like there's this like belief in like product and design that it's like, oh, it's all user feedback and trust the data and like how much should be gut versus data. But there's this like feeling of like the best teams are like really user focused and that's where everything comes from. I think that something has to be a level of annoying that's like that reaches beyond sort of a threshold for you to hear about it from users. And actually, like if you ignore your own gut feel, you're like letting through a lot of paper cuts. When product teams trust their own gut on things versus like fully on data, I think it yields a better product, even though like all the startup advice you hear on Twitter or whatever like says the opposite.
Yeah, because all of the startup advice is like formed from like, all the former Google PMs and Facebook PMs talking about how to build a startup. Yeah, because they had a shit ton of data. Like, just that stuff just doesn't affect how like a founder does it.
Well, we have a lot of data too. Like 300,000 jams are created a month, right? So it's not. I mean, like it's more than 250,000 jams a month that we could use as data, right? Like
right. No. I think that's totally fine. But like, imagine like you're just starting a company. What data analysis are you gonna do? But the way they like talk about like startup advice, it's gone down now. Like it's not as much. But I remember when I was a PM and like other former Meta and like Google PMs would talk about things. Oh, you gotta think about it and scale in like trillion requests. I'm like, okay, if you're starting a company tomorrow, there is no trillion requests. Anyway, mini rant.
I was gonna say it is a difference in process of like I don't know. I'd imagine a different way you could go with this is like Chris, you'd be like, all right, here are 3 options. I'm gonna like show them to you. I'm gonna like show them to users, maybe show them to the team, poll everybody, get like feedback on that. Where it seems like this was like, no, it's like we do the options, trust our gut, ship it, and we go, right? Or tell me if I'm wrong, but
yeah, and it's like because we know that it's iterative and we're gonna get feedback on whatever moves that we make, and we can learn from there. But it felt, it's like maybe you want to do more testing when stakes are really high, versus like we're making smaller moves that are like quality of life kind of improvements, and yeah, like trusting our gut for what are some of those moves that are really going to be like, wow, this is so much more useful now. But yeah, it's like we will always have that infusion of feedback and go through, you know, there will probably be more iterations of this in the future. But
I think one of the advantages of building dev tools as a startup is that you're kind of your own user in many ways. Like big companies use Jam, but within every big company, there's also like a Jam-sized team. Like Jam-sized teams operate together to build the parts of a big company. And so it's not like we're so different from our users. Like, yes, there are differences, but our guts are useful. And I don't know. I think the startup lore is like, don't trust your gut, fully rely on users, show 3 options to users, only do user research. But I don't know. I think that like opinionated software is just yields these like great results and, you know, bold moves, try things.
Opinionated software. I've never heard that term before. Is that
I saw, who did I see? I saw Brian Lovin use it on Twitter the other day.
that also feels like a shirt, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. This podcast is really just our ideation for our own swag and other startup swag.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've had this debate with designers and like other people too. It's like intuition is a form of data in a way. Like, what is it? It's a collection of a million tiny inputs and outputs, and like pattern recognition and mapping meaning. And so like that is worth quite a lot. And like good instincts are valuable. You know, it's like, to Danny's point, there are things that like we truly don't know, and we need to get really informed and dialed in, super connected to users to make those kind of bets. But like there's other things where I feel like we can trust our own intuition as users of the product and meaningfully advance the ball down the field.
Another thing Chris has been working on, I think this is like super interesting. Like, kind of, it feels like we're learning as we're doing. But Chris, you're working on an onboarding flow for a paid product within Jam. And there are a lot of considerations about onboarding in a PLG company where the product has to do the selling, tell you the why behind, like, why should you jump through these hoops to set up this thing? Why should you pay for it? How to get your team on board? Like, all of that happens in the product. And the onboarding is like such a critical moment. It's make or break. And you've been thinking a lot about how the product does this PLG motion and this onboarding flow. And maybe it's worth chatting about onboarding for a bit.
Yeah, kind of still in the shaping phase and figuring out exactly how it works. But
and I'm curious, maybe it'd be helpful to be concrete about what that phase is. Like, we're at the phase where you talked to customers about it, it's in people's hands, and now we're saying, how do we introduce, or how do we onboard, or
yes, the phase is basically onboarding is the last problem you want to solve, right? Because if you just spend a bunch of time on onboarding, but the product isn't good, then like no amount of great onboarding is going to, like, you kind of want to tackle one problem at a time. So we first built this product, and then we did handheld onboarding, like Irtefa on a call helping a user get set up. And once users were successful that way, we're like, great, now it's time to make it self-serve. And how do we take all of the help and context that Irtefa brings to a call and make the product say those things on its own in a context where people don't read. So words don't have, like the design has to do these things.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of like unique challenges with this. One is it's going to be an add-on for teams and going to be free during a beta period, but eventually something that'll be part of like pricing, like add-on for teams, right? So we're within Jam, we're within a team, we have this add-on construct. And then it's an extension of Jam that lives in another product, but has connective tissue between the two. So it's like a little bit of a unique challenge, and like we're expecting and hoping for new customers to come in to Jam, like just because of the like what this product can do on another platform. So that's like a first for Jam, like Jam in new places, and it works in a kind of specific way on like the capture side of things. So there's that aspect to it. It's like, how do we find a place within the product where we can like educate people about this when it's ready? How do we tell them how it works? To Danny's point, like if they go down that self-service route, how are we like really holding their hand at each step? And you know, one thing we're trying to do in the copy and content and kind of messaging overall is less emphasis on the what. So like at this step, we need you to do this so that, you know, this other thing can happen. Instead of that, more like what's the why behind it? Like why are you going to be compelled and motivated to keep going? And, you know, hopefully it's not much of a learning curve, but there are a couple like new constructs here that we need to like tell people about. So we're really trying to be like benefit led and kind of like why are you doing this, and kind of reinforcing that at every point.
The thing Chris said is I think really important. So I think that people don't want to feel pain or do hard things because survival instincts, right? And so if you're asking someone to do something that's moderately annoying or painful, like learn a new tool, then or like click some buttons and configure some settings because you need to set up this new tool, there has to be a compelling enough reason of what they will be on the other side if they go through. And so like you can either show them and say like other people have done this and they've achieved this result, you can achieve this result too, like follow the model, right? Or you can say like when you cross this path, you will now have obtained this, you will be this, like this is how we promise to change you. And then of course the product has to keep up with that promise, but it has to make the promise in the first place, or you just get these like drop-offs and onboarding, like and so I think the what versus the why is really, really important. We did this a bit in the current Jam onboarding. So like when you sign up for Jam, I think like the first version, it was just like, you know, share console logs and screen recording in a link or something like that. And then over time, it like the copy changed more to you know, get ready to fix bugs in record time or wherever we ended up. But it's like trying to use like small lines in product copy to indicate what we promise to you as a company if you stick with us and go through this onboarding.
Yeah, it reminds me of I forgot who originally talked about this, but in the book Product-Led Onboarding, the author talks about like when you're like signing up for a product, you're not signing up to, oh, I'm like trying to like solve this specific problem. Like for example, when you're signing for Jam, it's not like, oh, I want to create these like videos with console logs and network requests. No, you are basically imagining a future version of yourself that is more productive, that is giving more educational, that is making the relationship with like engineers better because they're now providing more utility with every single link that they send. So you're imagining a version of yourself. So like the copy that we show in onboarding is not about solving the problem, but helping you imagine the person that you aspire to be. And we're just helping you do that.
It's beautiful.
Right. It's like identity is motivating. It's like, what version of myself am I going to become?
The other like thing we sort of riffed on in this onboarding work that Chris is doing is, okay, if you imagine like you're using a SaaS product and then you like sign up for another feature of the SaaS product or like, you know, whatever, another product within the suite or whatever it is, you sort of can like imagine what that looks like. Like maybe there are like a bunch of modals that take you through like setting up the new product, right? Like, okay, we use Stripe. Like if we turn on another feature of Stripe, we can kind of imagine what that's like, right? And so the first version, we were like, okay, so there's a bunch of modals in the product and, you know, they guide you through whatever. And then we're looking at it and we're like, wow, this feels so standard. And the onboarding is a moment where we're giving you like, we're making promises to the user. And one of the promises is, how do we want you to feel every time you engage with this? And it's like, do we want you to feel like this is standard, or do we want you to feel like this was crafted and intentional for you? Like there was a lot of like, you know, like sweat and energy and all these things that went in to make this what it is. And like stick with it, stick with the onboarding, sign up, because there's a hardworking team behind this that just loved the craft of making this for you. And so it's like actually like a standard onboarding. Yes, it's like dead simple and that's great, but it doesn't feel like how we'd want people to feel. Like when we do onboarding calls for this, we don't say like, this is a standard product you're signing up for. We're saying like, hey, like so much research went into this. This is like how we think this thing should work in the future. And we're like, so like dead set on you trying this because we think it will be beneficial in these ways. And so how does like an onboarding convey that visually? And also like weighing that with like everything that we do that's non-standard is like more like technical debt in the design system that like, yeah, totally bites us. And so that was also kind of an interesting conversation with Chris as we were reviewing. Should we pivot to challenges of the week?
I can go with one of my challenges. Basically, I'm trying to think about the right stages to ask for input when I'm in the process of making a video. Because I guess what I've found is, as I've experimented with different parts of this, is that there's just different ways you could go about it in different times within. And just like we talked about with this Slack example, there's this level of like, you know, intuition and just drive and get it done that I feel. And then there's also on the other side, this, you know, you want to get people's buy-in and their involvement because it ultimately makes the thing better, right? Ideally. And so I guess the challenge that I felt is that I feel like I'm in a bit of a place where in Slack, I get to a milestone and I say, hey, can I get your take on this? And I'm wondering, when is the right time to actually say, hey, before I'm actually going to do the work, I want to envision this thing or this concept or whatever. And like, if there's anything to think about, when is the right time to have a synchronous before versus just, hey, I did this thing. Can I get your take on it? I'm going to continue to run with it with your feedback.
A perennial creative challenge.
Yeah, Chris,
challenge for creative work. Yeah, I definitely have this challenge too. Like what I find is there's a certain amount of work that has to happen internally to get your arms around a challenge. And it's like, I think some people are great about being able to do that, like literally at any point in the process, because they know even if they have an idea that it's just a tiny little seedling, it needs a lot of nurturing, that they feel like they could totally trust the people around them and they trust themselves to hold on to that seed, and therefore like are totally fine with sharing like, hey, I have this super initial idea, but it's not baked out at all. I think some people are great with that. I'm definitely the kind of person who needs to like protect that seed and like water it and nurture it and have it be something that I can then be like, I've looked at it, I'm looking at all the angles, like let's talk about it now. But yeah, it's definitely that push and pull of like, to have a perspective on something, to have a productive conversation. It feels like, at least for me, it takes just a certain amount of time to like think through the options, like work with your hands, and have something like tangible.
It's so funny because you're so right, and I know it from the other side as like the person who like reacts to things, where I think I want to see things early, but as soon as I see something, I react to it very strongly, right? And so like for example, I'll be like, oh, like show me this thing as early as you have something, just to like make sure we're aligned in direction. And if I see something really early, I'm like, oh, it doesn't look good. And then it's like, well, yeah, this is like the earliest thing because you told me to show you this so early, right? And so it's funny how like on the feedback giver side, you kind of feel like, oh, I want to see things early. And then the truth is, it's like there's like a skill in being able to see where this is going versus reacting to the thing. And I don't have that skill, and I probably shouldn't see anything, right? Like, if that makes sense.
It makes me think like as early as it's beautiful, in the right, as early as it's like in the ballpark of acceptability / like, you know, that you're just not going to self-edit so much, right? Like maybe that's one way to think about it, because it's like, I know if I just share as quick as it's a bit, like as quick as I could possibly get something together, it's like, oh no, I would change, like what you're going to say, I'm going to say, right? Or maybe not exactly, but you know, I want to make all these changes. I see it. And then I want to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do this. And I guess you want to get it to a place where it's like, you're actually past your own thinking on it a bit, so that someone else's input can really shape the direction of it, rather than something that all the things that you would want to try with it.
Yeah. The thing that like Ivana and I have agreed on is that like, if she is showing me something that's really, really raw, that she has to tell me, like otherwise I will react like unhelpfully, because I'll just say the things that she knows, and like and it's not helpful to be like, this doesn't look polished, you know, when this is not polished.
Ian, yeah, what you said resonates. It's like you want to like take it to a certain level where you can be in the other person's shoes and like totally anticipate the things that they're gonna say or think, and to also maybe like communicate, here's where this is at, and here are the things I'm thinking about next, or the things I know that aren't in here, if you have an expectation of like anticipating that feedback and getting ahead of it. It's definitely an art and a science though, because there's also, if you wait too long, you could totally have wasted a bunch of time on something that like is just the wrong direction, or like you didn't have pieces of really critical context that early conversation would have gotten you. So it's like, yeah, you also don't want to wait too long and like super bake something out, because we want to we want to make sure it's the right thing.
Danny, what are your challenges this week?
We're hiring. That is not the challenge. Like, that is a challenge. That is not the challenge. The challenge is, well, part of hiring is just talk to a lot of people, and it means that my calendar is a lot fuller than maybe typically is, and it means that I have to. Yeah, it means that the challenge is like, what's actually a priority, and when do I get like thinking time versus action time, and like when I, it's all like time management and prioritization this week. That's totally the challenge. This week, next week, the week after. Like when I look at my calendar, I'm like, oh, we got to be a little ruthless on some priorities.
I'm surprised that's not a challenge for you every week.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, maybe that specific part is not new. That's every week.
I think that usually there's a lot of work to do, but there's not usually like walls of calls, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. It's like, if your smartest hours of the day, you're sitting in, it's like, where does the rest of the work happen, and how can it be productive? And
I think it's cool to me that you get to interview so many people. I just think from a perspective of getting to meet getting to meet so many people, to see how many people do all these things, like it's like this incredible context that you don't get as someone who doesn't interview a lot of people. And it's like to understand how how you feel the org and how the org works and how different, like it helps you, I would imagine, just understand the team better too, to know all these people that have these different types of experiences. So it's cool too.
It's honestly been like amazing. And some people have been really nice and like really like generous and hopping on a call. Like I'll try to recruit them, and they're like, I'm not looking for a job, but I've like sourced for this type of role before, and I can be helpful, and they jump on, they give advice. And through that, especially, I've met people who like built the products that I grew up on. And like, that's been like so cool. So yeah, it's,
that's awesome.
I'm not saying calls are bad, but I think the challenge is around like time boxing and prioritization.